and welcome to Make It Stick, some training that we've developed as part of the Change Schools partnership. This was as a result of our first year of the new curriculum SATs results in 2016. As a country, we were obviously quite concerned about the dip in results and the real raised expectations compared to previous years. And so we knew that as a group of schools, we needed to look at things differently and come up with some different strategies, because we knew that what we couldn't do was extend the school day, teach children for longer and cram more into them. So we knew we needed to look at outside the box at the way that we were already teaching. So first of all, I want you to have a think about what your primary role as an educator is. So just give that a little bit of a thought. And I guess for us, what we think is that our job as teachers is to take children on a journey. They arrive with us in early years foundation stage as almost blank canvases, and it's our job to kind of impart knowledge and skills into them, so that as they leave us, they're more than capable to manage the next stage of their learning, both at secondary school and then as lifelong learners. So next thing I want you to have to think about is what we know about memory. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard about terms like long-term memory, short-term memory, and working memory, and that ultimately our short-term memory, we can only hold a certain amount. I've got a limited space to hold that information in, but actually our long-term memory is virtually limitless. So actually there's some real kind of inaccurate research out there and messages out there saying that we only use 10% of our brains, but actually we don't. We have the full use of the full capacity. So it's actually limitless, the amount that we could actually remember if we have the right strategies to be able to do that. Just give you a chance to have a read of that. Okay, so we've thought about memory. Now I want you to have a little think about what we know about forgetting. Nice little pictures there to get you to think. Okay, so what we know is that over time we forget things. I'm sure you've all got examples about that. And the way that we can stop forgetting things is by interrupting that forgetting process. And some of the strategies we're going to talk about today will help to interrupt that forgetting and make sure that things actually stay in the long-term memory. So, first strategy that we're going to think about today is quizzing. Now, it's very intentionally quizzing and not testing. So this is not about high-stakes testing like SATs and GCSEs and driving tests or anything like that. This is about low-stakes quizzing. Okay, and there's a few ideas here to give you an idea about the types of quizzing that you could be doing with your children. So we could be thinking about multiple choice tests. We could be thinking about the use of flashcards. We could be using scenarios like true or false questions and then asking children to justify those. We could be asking children to record 10 facts about their learning. We could be getting them to be doing lots of self-quizzing as well, reviewing the learning that's already happened in that lesson or maybe a previous lesson or a previous term, writing a summary of everything that they've learned or rewriting in their own words. And one of my personal favourites, which I think we'll revisit in a little bit, which is about what's your favourite big idea for today. So similar to a summary. Okay. Now, the reason that quizzing works is that actually it requires effort in order to be able to retrieve that information. And the greater the effort, the greater the retention you're going to get. Now, where this works particularly well is actually when children or adults know at the beginning of the lesson or the beginning of the unit that actually there is going to be some sort of quiz, some sort of retrieval at the end, because actually they're going to start intentionally learning that information with more effort because they know at some point they're going to need to retrieve that information. Okay, a couple more strategies for you. So one is elaboration. So this is the process of finding additional layers of meaning in new material, relating the material to what you already know. So, for example, it might be explaining what you've learnt to somebody else in your own words, or it might be about relating that to your own personal experience in some way. Okay, so that's elaboration. Another strategy that's mentioned within the book, Make It Stick, is generation, which is an attempt to answer a question or solve a problem before being shown the answer or the solution. So this might be that actually at the very beginning of a lesson, you're going to give children a question. So it might be a maths lesson. You're going to give them a division question right at the beginning of the lesson to actually see if they can stretch themselves and see if they can grapple with that information right at the beginning of the lesson. And the theory behind this is that by puzzling through something, you're far more likely to learn and remember the solution than if somebody just sat you down and just told it to you. Because actually you've put some effort into that and you've already kind of put the time into it. So you're more likely to remember that information that you've learned. So that's generation. Two more strategies for you. Okay, so the one I said earlier that I thought was one of my favourites is the big idea. So for children, actually, this is a summarisation strategy, and it's good for all of us, and it's good for actually when we were looking at thinking about all the information about Make It Stick. For us, what we kept looking at is what are the big ideas within this book. So it might be even if you were doing a history unit on the Romans, actually saying at the throughout that topic, what are the big ideas here? What are the things that we've learned about it? And what it helps is it makes it forces you to make cognitive connections between different bits of information that are going to help to retain that knowledge and so that it's ready for retrieving later. Another strategy I really like, but that might be because I was an early years teacher for a lot of my career, is explain like I'm 5. So if you can explain something, elaborate it in a meaningful way that another person can understand using your own words and connect it to something that you already know, then you have mastery. So it means that you've internalized that information so well, you fully understand it, that you can apply it and explain it in a different situation. Okay. Next strategy from the book is about avoiding illusions of knowing. Okay, so they use the term calibration a lot, so being able to calibrate what your judgment is. So sometimes what we do is that we will continue to learn the things that we already know and practice those a lot because they're easy, and we'll avoid the things that are harder to learn because, well, they're hard. So the important thing is to have some strategies where you can calibrate what you actually know and what you actually don't know. And the other part within that is sometimes we think we know something and actually we've put a twist on it, or we've summarized it too much and we've missed the main point. So it's really important that we have a range of strategies so that we can calibrate what we really know and what we really need to work on. Okay. So I think when we work with children in particular, what we also need to be careful of is that when we've taught something and we've tested it a few times, we checked it a few times and they know it, often we leave that material, don't we? And from an efficiency point of view, we move on to something else. And then when we eventually return to that information, children have then forgotten it. So another part of calibration is about that regular checking to make sure that actually you still know it, even when there's been a period of time between when you last learnt it. Okay. And what they've said in there is about how if it is important, it needs to be practiced and practiced again. So we can't revisit things enough. Okay. So the best two things in order to make sure that we calibrate our judgments, best two tools for us are corrective feedback, and that could be might be written feedback through marking in books, or it might be verbal feedback throughout lessons, and quizzing. So referring back to those strategies we had on the previous slide. Okay, active retrieval now. When we're talking about when we put things into get things into our long-term memory, there are two parts to that. Once they're in the long-term memory, what we don't want them to do is to get lost there. We need to be able to retrieve that memory when we need it, okay? And that requires effortful retrieval, okay? And the way that we can make that cognitive pathway work really well is by putting effort on that retrieval, by doing it repeatedly. We can use our low stakes quizzing, again, so not testing, but quizzing. Okay, and I've got a couple of graphs here that are just going to show you the impact that has on children's achievements. So if children just learn something once, as you can see, that has the lowest impact in terms of children's future outcomes. And the one that has the most amount of impact is where children have had retrieval practice, so using all of those strategies that we've talked about before. What's also interesting is when we actually add corrective feedback in there, the impact that has increases the retrieval even better. So it means that it has even better impact on children's achievements. Okay, so the message here, and hopefully you've had time to have a look at those tables, we need to practice getting knowledge and skills from our long-term memories. It's a skill, and skills require practice. So we have to make sure that we're giving children lots of time to be able to practice doing that. Okay, so I want you to have a little think now back to when you were last studying. So whatever that was for, whether that was a driving test theory or it was your degree or whatever it was, it's something that you were really trying to learn something. What strategies did you use? When you've had a thought about that, think about those. Were they effective? That's my next question. And why do you think that they were effective? Now, for me and for lots of us, all around the world, the number one strategy skills that tend to be used, particularly for kind of higher education, is to read, reread, highlight. So when we have our course material, we keep reading, we reread it again, we highlight the sections that we think are important, and essentially we cram, which is known as mass practice. And what happens with that strategy is it does work. It does work. It makes us feel fluent, and we become very familiar with the content. So when we go back and reread something, we do think, oh yeah, I have read this, which makes us think that we know it. Again, the illusion of knowing. Okay, so we think we know it, but actually a few days later it's gone and we've forgotten that knowledge. And I'm sure we've all got examples of when we were at school or university, something that we really crammed and we learned. Actually, if somebody asked us that information now, we would not have a clue. It would be really hard, if not impossible, to be able to retrieve that information. Ultimately, what we want is for ourselves and for children and for everyone to become real masters of that information, that they truly, truly understand it. And the way that we can do that is through interleaved, spaced and varied practice. We're going to explore some of those in the next few slides. Okay, so what does that look like? Interleaved, spaced and varied practice. So there is lots of examples out here that you can go and have a look at further. Put that into Google. You'll get lots of videos, lots of great sports examples, and lots of different examples there that show how well this works. So we need to mix up the order of practice for problems for greater retention. We need to be planning starter activities based on content from previous learning. So we're mixing that up and we're interleaving what we already know alongside the new learning. Okay, so we're going to design learning sequences which factor in time to reteach and review content. We're going to focus less on revision at the end and more on reviewing throughout that learning sequence. Okay. We'll use cumulative tests and quizzes. Remember, they're low stakes, as in they are not life and death, okay, throughout the lesson or lessons. We're going to explain the evidence behind the method so that children really understand how this approach is helping them. So we're not just going to give them a strategy, we're going to talk about why that's helpful to them, because if they've got that level of understanding, that depth of knowledge, it's going to keep them going. Now, the thing with these strategies, and when I was putting this training together and I was reading the book Make It Stick, what I found, I tried to apply these strategies, and what I found is they do feel clunky. Massed practice, so that cramming practice, feels much more productive. It feels like you're actually really getting to know that material, but you're not. You're developing fluency with that material and not mastery of that material. In order to really be masters of it, we must persist with this strategy in order for it to be productive. So that's where we also have to make sure that we're applying our growth mindset. Lovely quote here for you. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit. And a little moment in the middle here, just for you to reflect on some of the things that we've thought about so far. Okay, ready to move on. Okay, so more strategies that are described within the book Make It Stick. So mnemonics and memory palaces. So what do you already know about that? Okay, what's your understanding of these techniques so far? And what's your experience in your own learning? So you might find that you've got some examples of mnemonics that you might still remember. Memory palaces, you might have heard that term, and we'll link to that in a moment. Okay. Have you got any examples of when you've already tried to use some of these with children as well? So let's have a look at some mnemonics that you might remember. Some spelling ones, some ones for music, for different science terms as well. Okay, memory palaces next. So I've got an example here and a video. You'll need to find that link on Google. It's a lovely link to Sherlock Holmes and when he goes to his mind palace. Okay, so I'll let you find that and have a little look at that later. So memory palaces are a way of people being able to learn some really complicated, large amounts of information and be able to retrieve it in an efficient and effective way. So it's a really good technique for memory, and lots of memory specialists and memory champions use these techniques. So again, there's lots of great videos. Go and have a little look at some of the memory champions. They're incredible, the things that they can remember and the strategies they use for doing that. There's some bit more information on here about what a memory palace is. And a bit of information about how to create one. Okay, so I guess my challenge for you is to see if you can have a go, see if you can learn a long list of information using this strategy and see if it works. There's a link here as well for you to go to have a further look at some of the ideas about building businesses. Okay, so whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. So back to a little bit of growth mindset work and the work from Carol Dweck. And this really, all of these strategies, they're only going to work if you've got your climate right for learning, and that children really understand and adults really understand. Actually, it needs to start with adults, what having a growth mindset really means. Carol Dweck's come under some scrutiny over the last kind of couple of years, where people have tried to disprove her theory, and it is a theory, and she'll say it's a theory. She's a scientist at first, but what she'll also say is that there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what having a growth mindset means, and a lot of examples where teachers have just put up a poster on the wall about having a growth mindset, and then what the way they describe it is it's just about having a go and having a try and trying harder and putting in more effort, and that's a little simplistic really around growth mindset. And we have to be really careful that actually what we're doing is we're not just nagging children. So we do have to have a full understanding of growth mindset. So I urge you to make sure you go back to some original research from Carol Dweck or one of her colleagues to really look at what that really, really means, because it's bigger than just putting effort in. We have got to make sure that we've got the right strategies in place, and we've got to make sure that we have lots and lots of practice to be able to get there, and that self-belief, but also know that it is hard work and we need that grit and perseverance to be able to do it. What they say is, and there's examples time after time again, whether that's in sport, whether that's in chess, whether that's in music, where people have become experts, and it's not that they were born that way. If you want to become an expert, you've got the right attitude, you've got the right opportunities, and you're prepared to give it the time, you probably can. So developing a growth mindset. So what do we need to do? We can coach children to try different learning strategies, and that's the important thing, and teach children about the brain and how it works. And we need to make sure that when we're praising children, we are praising the right things and the right attitudes and the effort that they've put in, and when they've chosen the right strategies, and that we're encouraging children to reflect on themselves as learners. Okay, it is more complicated than it looks, but ultimately what we want is for children to become intrinsically motivated, independent learners. And the most important thing is that we model that ourselves. So I think quite often, I know I certainly would have said that I was, my natural state is actually a fixed mindset. So I have to work quite hard to make sure that I have a growth mindset, particularly in difficult circumstances or difficult situations. So, as adults, we have to constantly question that. And one of the things that I would always recommend is to put yourself in a growth mindset situation regularly. So actually put yourself in a situation of new learning and remember what that feels like. Okay, so part of that then will help to create that climate that's going to be conducive to developing a growth mindset in our children. Okay, and some other further bits there just to have a read of. So it is about developing those relationships and being honest with children about what learning feels like. Okay. The other part within that is about mistakes. And really, on the next kind of few slides, we're going to have a look at the different kinds of mistakes and what difference, how we analyse those, because it isn't just, again, the phrase we learn from our mistakes. We have to make sure that we're reflecting on the types of mistakes that we're making. So we'll have a look over the next few slides. So a couple of quotes for you. Okay, making mistakes. So I've got a table here that kind of looks at the 4 different types of mistakes. And I think even when you first look at those titles in there, you can already see examples, can't you, of what they look like and actually which ones are okay to be making and which ones aren't. So we'll start with the one that really are the ones that we need to be avoiding as much as possible. Okay, so our high stakes mistakes. Okay, so we need to minimize these, and really when they do happen, we have to learn the greatest lessons to ensure that they don't happen and become catastrophic in the future. Okay, so how we do in these events gives us information about how effective we have become through our hard work and effort. Okay, but we want to make sure that we're putting processes in place to minimise high stakes mistakes. So I guess the example here that's been quite recent and quite relevant for all of us has been that first round of SATs testing on the new curriculum, because with that, actually, that was a high stakes situation, and we have to remember that actually children feel the pressure in those situations, and actually they then don't necessarily perform the way that we know that they could do if they weren't feeling that high pressured environment. So there's some things to reflect on there. Okay, the next one on here is around stretch mistakes, which are positive. So this is about taking ourselves just slightly outside of our comfort zone, and they talk about the zone of proximal development, which is actually the point where new learning happens and where progress happens. So this isn't about giving yourself a challenge, learning something that is so far out of reach, because that's near on impossible and actually could lead to a real attitude of what's the point. What we want to be doing is to be giving children work and challenges that is just that little stretch ahead of where they're at the moment. That's where the greatest progress happens. Aha mistakes are also positive. They're not always easy to plan for, but they're the sorts of moments where I guess in history there's lots of science ones, how gravity was discovered, how light bulbs were first invented. They had all kind of come from aha moment mistakes. So actually something that they thought was going to happen, something different happened, but actually they had a wow moment within that. Okay. And then we have, which I'm sure you've all got examples on, are our sloppy mistakes. Okay, so the ones that actually where, and particularly if they were doing a test, ones where children perhaps haven't read the question properly, or they hadn't recorded in the right way, or they'd missed 2 pages out in the middle of the paper. I suppose the only other type of, I guess that sort of fits within there as well, is actually around timings. So sometimes children just haven't scored on a paper because they haven't been able to have enough stamina to be able to get themselves through the paper. So again, it's about analysing what has happened, because then we can react and make a plan linked to the type of mistakes that's happening. Okay. Another little summary of the content that we've talked about so far. Always important to get enough sleep, and always make reference to Maslow's hierarchy of need in this point, actually, of children or adults. If we haven't had enough sleep, if we haven't been fed properly, if we're not feeling well, actually learning is going to be pretty impossible, isn't it? So always make sure we've got those layers in there, and actually that right to leisure time as well, making sure that children had some fresh air and had some time outside to take a breath from everything as well, because learning is hard and it takes lots of effort, so we have to make sure that physically we're in the right place to be able to do that. So this was a set of training that was based on a book that we read called Make It Stick by the 3 authors here. Which have a little think for yourself now about what you thought the book was about. What were the key messages? What will you take away from this practice? And how will this change your practice? Here's a little summary, an extra summary, to get you to have a think about the strategies that have been referred to in the book. And over the next few pages, there's just a summary of each of the chapters for you to have a read through. A nice little summary of the message on and a bit of information about the authors of the book, of which we did write to, and we had some really lovely feedback. They are based in America, so but the research they pull in through the book is from across the world. They did say that they are going to come over to the UK at some point, so I have requested for them to come and do some work with Change Partnerships. So hopefully we'll hear from them one day. If not, I'll send them a little reminder email at some point to tell them that we're still here. There's some links here as well to some further bits linked to the book and to the researchers. Okay, and here's a summary of each of the chapters. It gives you a little into the book each time. It's well worth reading. This is calibration. Growth mindset. And the final chapter. Okay, so if you can refer now back to your precision pedagogy document, and there are 4 pages within here that summarise the learning in this training around Make It Stick. So you can use it as your reference point. Hopefully it summarises things enough so that you've got a reference to go back to. So last of all, I just want you to think once again what the book was about, what the key messages were, what you will take away today, and how that's going to change your practice. I hope you found the training helpful today. If you want to ask any further questions, please ask a member of our Trust Lead team, and we'll be really happy to answer those. We've got lots of examples already across the partnership of where this is working well. Maths meetings are a particularly strong example that use all of the principles from Make It Stick and are making, I think, a real significant impact on achievement of pupils at the end of Key Stage 2 and throughout their primary school. But please speak to one of us. We love the work here, and hopefully it will be something that you can take away and put into your practice too.